Have you ever stepped into a house so eerily silent that it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath? Imagine walking through a home where the air feels thick with fear and then discovering a gruesome murder. But that's not even the worst part. The murderer didn't leave. No, they stayed. Days after the murders, the house continued to be used, seemingly revealing the killer's presence in plain sight. But what made the Hinterkaifeck Murders so disturbing wasn't just the bloodshed. It was the mystery that followed. A mystery that still haunts investigators and keeps people awake at night. It was a cold, dark March evening in 1922. A rural farmhouse sat quietly in the forest of Bavaria, Germany. The Hinterkaifeck farm was completely isolated from the nearest town. No neighbors lived nearby, and the nearest village was miles away. To reach the farm, you had to pass through winding forest paths, making it nearly impossible to notice anything unusual from the outside. The farm was home to Andreas Gruber, his wife, his daughter, and his 4 grandchildren. Despite the isolation, the Grubers were known to be a friendly, hard-working family. But over the past few weeks, there had been strange happenings on the farm. Andreas Gruber had noticed footprints in the snow that led from the woods to his farm, but the prints seemed to appear out of nowhere and led to the barn. He was confused, but with no one around for miles, he shrugged it off. But things were getting worse. At night, strange sounds echoed from the barn, and there were reports of lights flickering in the windows, even when the family was asleep. But on March 31st, everything changed. The family vanished. On the night of March 31st, 1922, the Gruber family was murdered in their own home. Andreas Gruber, his wife, his daughter, and the 2 grandchildren were all slaughtered in brutal fashion. The crime scene was horrifying. The family had been bludgeoned with a pickaxe, and the bloodshed was unimaginable. But the most terrifying part of the crime wasn't just the brutality. It was the eerie calm that followed. When the neighbors went to check on the family, they were greeted by silence. The animals in the barn were well cared for, and the house appeared undisturbed, but the family was nowhere to be found. Investigators found the bodies of the Gruber family inside the house, but what sent chills down their spines was the fact that the murderer didn't leave immediately. In fact, the killer stayed for days. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the murderer had been living in the farmhouse after the murders. The killer didn't run. Instead, they hid in the attic, using the family's food, firewood, and even bedding. For days, the murderer stayed in the house, sleeping in the same rooms as the dead, eating the food that was left behind, and even tending to the animals. Neighbors reported seeing the lights flicker in the windows of the farmhouse, but when they knocked on the door, no one answered. No one seemed to be home. Yet, when the police arrived and searched the premises, they found no sign of the killer. It was as if the murderer had disappeared into thin air. When authorities were called to the scene, they found the bodies of Andreas Gruber, his wife, and his 2 grandchildren, who had all been killed in the same brutal way. The crime scene was horrifying. Blood smeared across the walls, the floor, and even the ceilings. But there was something strange about it. The house was locked from the inside, and no one could figure out how the killer had entered. There were no broken windows, and the doors were still latched. The authorities were stumped. How could a murderer have gotten in? And why had they stayed in the house for days after the crime? It wasn't until a closer look at the barn that things started to get even weirder. The barn, which had once been locked, had been opened and left ajar. Inside, the family's animals were well fed, and no signs of a struggle were found. But the most disturbing discovery was the presence of footprints in the snow that led into the barn. They were fresh, but they didn't seem to belong to any of the family members. As investigators delved deeper into the mystery, they began to question everyone in the area. Was it someone from the village? A family member? A stranger? One of the first suspects was Carl, a man who had worked for the family on the farm in the past. He had been seen in the area shortly before the murders, but there was no evidence to tie him to the crime. Others suggested it could have been a local, someone who knew the farm and the family well, but nothing fit. The mystery deepened. Then, rumors began to circulate that the killer may have been someone who had been living in the house for days. Some even suggested the murderer had hidden in the attic, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But how could they have lived there without being noticed? The investigation turned up nothing that could definitively link anyone to the crime. There were also whispers of a supernatural element to the case. Some locals believed the farm was cursed. Over the years, rumors had circulated that the property was haunted by strange, unseen forces. Was the killer a person or something else entirely? The idea of the killer being a ghost or supernatural entity spread a meeting was held by our team on Monday with the client team for the Zephyr project to review the status of the forthcoming Q3 launch campaign. The campaign, originally built as an omni-channel activation across CTV, paid social, and programmatic display, is now subject to substantial midstream revisions, following newly surfaced client directives. The feedback introduces a material shift in strategic framing under a compressed delivery window. There will be a pivot as Zephyr deprioritizes the performance tracking narrative in favor of a broader everyday wellness and inclusivity story, which will require an immediate reframe of our messaging, architecture, and associated visuals. To address the revised scope, I've assigned immediate follow-up actions across the team. Visual art will lead conversations with post-production around stock content integration. Ad sales will recalibrate the media plan in light of the repositioned messaging and will coordinate with DSPs to avoid penalties related to insertion order delays. Copy desk is to be tasked with stripping all unsubstantiated medical claims from copy, implementing the new CTA, and managing a parallel review with legal. We conduct a daily internal stand-up each morning through the end of the week to identify blockers. The next client check-in is scheduled for July 3rd, where we will preview asset revisions and confirm compliance milestones. Final go-no-go is slated for July 7th at 17-hour PDT. We are proceeding with all mitigations in parallel and escalated any dependency delays as they surface quickly, especially after some neighbors reported seeing lights in the windows of the farmhouse. In the days following the murders, the most disturbing part was that no one could explain why the killer stayed in the house for so long. If it were a human, why didn't they flee after committing such a brutal crime? Why did they wait? The more questions they asked, the more the case seemed to spiral into the unknown. To this day, the Hinterkaifeck murders remain one of Germany's most chilling and unsolved mysteries. Every theory has been explored, from the plausible to the supernatural, but no one has ever come up with a definitive answer as to who killed the Gruber family or why they stayed in the house after the crime. In the decades since the murders, the farm was abandoned, and it eventually fell into disrepair. Locals still avoid the area, and some say the farm is haunted by the spirits of the Gruber family. Whether it's a case of a cold-blooded murderer hiding in plain sight or something far more sinister, the Hinterkaifeck murders continue to haunt investigators and thrill-seekers alike. The Hinterkaifeck murders were not only brutal and tragic, but they were also deeply unsettling because of the unanswered questions that followed. The fact that the killer stayed in the house, living among the dead, is what makes this case so unique and so terrifying. Even today, as investigators look back at the evidence, no one has been able to explain why the Gruber family died or what happened in those days after the murders. So, as you sit in the silence of your room tonight, imagine the chilling possibility that sometimes mysteries are never meant to be solved. Some secrets are buried so deeply that they're lost to time, forever haunting those who dare to dig.